So, good evening, everybody. Here we all are again for World War II TV. Another interview this time. It's the winter months, so the battlefield live streams will be a little bit thin on the ground. But joining me again, because she was on my Being a Historian panel, is Melissa Amateis. So, hi, Melissa, how are you?
I'm doing well, thank you.
And your book that we're going to talk about, amongst other things, has just come out this week. So, you must be all excited. And
Very much so. Yeah, it came out yesterday was the official day and people were able to pre-order it and I've had several people say, "Hey, it just arrived in the mail and can't wait to read it." So that's really exciting.
fantastic. So, and of course, I have read your book, and it is on Nebraska in World War II, amongst other books you've written and other books you are uh, in the middle of doing, which we'll get to later on. But it's for me, I like the fact that we're talking about the home front because we haven't on World War II TV yet really talked much about the home front. I mean, not just the home front; Nebraska contributed to the war effort as well, but the home front, apart from on my June the 6th broadcast, when we touched on how D-Day was reported back in the USA and UK, we haven't really touched on it again. And I'm glad we're doing it because to me, it's an important aspect of it. And I always remind people that for every person at the front, there are 15 or so behind them. There's all the people back home supporting with the industry. So, and you're a Nebraska girl. So you wrote about Nebraska, which makes perfect sense. And I like that. I like the fact people are doing their own history. Had Lloyd, a friend of mine, on earlier in the summer, talking about a Welsh poet because he's Welsh and he wrote about a Welsh poet. So I like that. It's all too easy to do all the sexy stuff, the 101st Airborne and the usual, so writing about your own state is good. So tell me how you got into writing history in the first place and how you got to the point where you're producing a book about your state.
Okay, well, I started writing when I was very young, about 12 years old. And I found my love of history through reading historical fiction, actually. And that is what really got me started. And I did my bachelor's degree in history and my master's. And it's just history is full of stories. And I really love telling them. And Nebraska has so much from World War II that I didn't even really realize until I started digging into my research. And it's amazing what this state, which is we call it flyover state because we're right in the middle of the country, and a lot of people think nothing happens here, but we made some very significant contributions during the war. So I'm really glad that I was able to put all these stories together for people.
Well, definitely, and and we'll touch on those stories as it goes on. So I like at the very beginning of your book, you say you're trying to straddle between being an academic work and also popular, and that's not easy to do, is it? Generally, it's so striking that balance between readability and kind of a page turning element with also getting in the detail is every historian and indeed YouTubers nightmare of exactly where do you hit the balance. So did that come
Yes.
easy to you when you're doing it, or do you have to make a conscious effort to kind of not go too geeky, or how does that
Yeah.
process work?
Yes, I had to make a conscious effort not to go too deep. I kind of went a little deep when I was talking about Ben Kuroki because I wanted to set the background for the anti-Japanese sentiment that was prevalent in the United States. But I also wanted to keep my audience in mind, and I knew that a lot of just the general population in Nebraska would be reading it, and I didn't want to go over their heads, so to speak. And that's not, I mean, academia does have a reputation of being kind of lofty at times in their words. And I guess I kind of want to break away from that a little bit, even when I do write my academic work. I want to write it in a readable way that everybody can access it. But it's
Well,
definitely a challenge.
I mean, it should be possible to do both. I mean, it isn't always
Yes,
possible to do both, but it should be possible
absolutely.
to do both. And I think your book succeeds in it. And Kevin Himmel, who's watching, said, "What's the book called?" It's World War II Nebraska. And well, there's a link below in the description, I believe, Kevin. If you would bother to check out the YouTube description, Kevin, I can have a go at him because he's a friend. And
Yes.
yeah, it a lot. It covered a lot, and I liked also that you put in a little bit of the background about the ice. I can't say the word now. the isolationist approach,
Yes.
because that's something as a Brit living in Normandy, when Americans come here, Churchill and things like that come up, and that era, Battle of Britain, and I remind them, but at that point, not all of the USA were even behind helping, let alone participating in the war. And that's something that I think gets really forgotten, that there's this period where the USA is kind of hedging its bets a bit. It's in fact, I wrote down my notes here. Edward Burke, a Nebraska politician, is actually the one who sort of starts the motion for a peacetime draft. And that was quite unpopular at the time. So explain how that came about and why it was a Nebraskan that kind of tried to get the ball rolling.
It was actually surprising to me that it was a Nebraskan who tried to get the ball rolling, because we're very conservative in this state. Like to not get into other people's business a lot. But the whole of America had participated. We saw what happened in the First World War, and so we kind of drew back into this isolationist mindset. And we didn't want our boys, the prevailing view in America at the time was, we don't want our boys dying over there for another European war. So I was really struck by how much Nebraskans were not, really too interested in this war. And that was, like I said, the prevailing mindset across the United States. I don't know a lot about Edmund Burke, the man who brought up the peacetime draft, but that would be another topic that I'd like to go into more someday.
Well, that's everything you ever do always leads to another spider's web of, oh, I should learn that, read about that, or I should go down that. And suddenly you find yourself trying to go down 20 different rabbit warrens, and then you end up being obsessed about it. But that I like the fact you didn't shy away from the fact that it wasn't a broadly popular policy to go and help out Europe, and understandably, it makes complete sense. But once the war, the war does begin, Nebraska throws itself in completely, and
Yes,
airfields, prisoner of war camps, and so we'll go through some of those things there. And the war dogs, I think I find the war dogs the most fascinating. Yes. And then of course there's a couple of people, you mentioned one already, a couple of notable people from the state who participated. Yes. So when you began, you said you were surprised how much it was involved. Which bit did you start with? Did you start with airfields? Because you wrote a book about POW camps before, so yes. I guess that was your starting point, I guess.
Yes, it was. And the further I had heard, well, the Enola Gay, which is what dropped the atomic bomb on Hiroshima, was built in Omaha. And I thought, well, okay, what else have we done? Well, we, Henry Dorley, who was the publisher of the Omaha World Herald, and Omaha is the biggest city in Nebraska, started the scrap drive, which became, nationwide. And I just kept digging and digging. I was like, we had all these Army airfields, and I knew about Fort Robinson because I worked there. Are you still there?
Well, that was fun. I completely lost internet. I warned Melissa earlier that I completely lost internet. I believe we're all back. If someone can just check and say, yes, we're all back. So I know we're all back on the chat. Yeah. I think we are. Yeah, I think we're all here. Well, that was fun. I completely lost internet. I warned Melissa earlier that I completely lost internet. I believe we're all back. Hang on, something's happening. I can hear myself twice now. So I know we're all back on the chat. Right, okay, I think we're back. Right. Why can I hear my audio twice? Yeah, I think we're all here. Wow, that was fun. What is going on here? Hang on, something's happening. I can hear myself twice now. I'm hearing my... testing. Are we hearing? Is anybody... I think we're still here. I am not sure. It says we're here. I'm wanting someone to check on the message that we're actually there.
Okay.
Can someone on the messenger just say if you can still hear this? Sorry about this, folks. I've never had this before. It was one of those days. Everything's been failing today. I'm not sure. I'll check if it's... Sorry about this, folks. I will just check on if I can get it, what's happening online. I'll go on my phone. Yeah, apparently it's all good now. Just that for some reason my chat hasn't caught up. Okay, I think we're good to go.
Okay, great.
Right, yeah, so I forgot where we were. I said how, yeah, we'll just start that bit again. So I was asking you started about with POW camps, and then that was your beginning bit to go into, and then how did you build on that? Well, let's talk about your POW camps book first, because that we might as well go back to that. That was a few years ago.
Yes, that was in 2015, and it grew out of my master's thesis. I used to work in my youth at Fort Robinson, which is a fort in northwest Nebraska, and it's been there since the Indian Wars. And I found out when I was working there that there was a German prisoner of war camp there. So when I went to graduate school and decided to focus on World War II, I mentioned that to my advisor, and he said, you should write a book about, or write your thesis on that. And I said, good idea. So I wrote my thesis on the POW camps, and then my publisher contacted me and said, why don't you write a book on all of the POW camps across Nebraska? And there were several. So that's how that started. And that was quite an interesting journey as well. Ever since I wrote that, I've given several talks and presentations around the state. And I always have somebody in the audience who comes up to me or asks a question and says, I remember when those German POWs worked on my dad's farm, or I remember seeing them in town. So it was a very real connection that I had there. So when actually my publisher contacted me a few years later and said, would you like to write a book about Nebraska during World War I? And I said, that's not my specialty, but I would love to do one on World War II. So that's what started this journey. And I just started, looking at the newspapers and digging around, and more came to light. And it was just a really great experience.
Well, and I'm sure it went more smoothly than this show is going. So that's so yeah, I'm still not sure. I'm having to check the phone as well. Everything's I think it's okay. Yeah, with the POW camps, and I've got several books on different states and their POW camps, because there was an extraordinary amount, because for those watching, tens of thousands of German POWs and Italian POWs were taken to Italy, from Italy and Europe to the USA, and France later on, and Germany, and partly it was to ensure kind of safe journeys for the ships on their way back across Atlantic, because the German U-boats wouldn't attack boats with POWs in. But that then helped out with the war effort, because you, as you said there, you had people on the fields and extra people to work there, and it all went from there. So the POW camp side of things is very interesting, and there, and you touch on that in your Nebraska book as well, and your various escapes and what have you, which none of which were completely successful, but
No.
it's interesting. But the
Yes.
airfield is what really interested me, because you have the space in the USA to put an awful lot of airfields, and you put a lot in Britain as well, and Nebraska had, was it 11?
Yes, there was 11.
And the one I'm particularly interested in, because I'm living in Normandy, is the one in Alliance, because that's where some of the Parachute Infantry Regiment guys got their training, including the 507th, who jumped about 25 miles up the road from me, west of Santa Maria Glees. So how did that end up being selected, particularly for parachute training? Because Nebraska's not very close to anywhere else where paratroops were doing their stuff. So that must be kind of a fascinating story, how they ended up doing it over there.
And I really wanted to delve more into all of that, but I didn't have the time or the space. I don't know for sure why the 507th was there, but I do know that part of it was because of the landscape. We up in Northwest Nebraska, well, Alliance is about 40 miles from where I grew up, and it's very, it's the plains, very flat ground, wide open skies, not very many trees. So it's the perfect place to practice your parachuting and fly your planes. And because we have, these great, we don't have any forests here. We have a little bit in Northwest Nebraska, but it's basically just, wide open spaces. So it's perfect for flying the planes and building all these. We had lots of room because Nebraska is very, we don't have very many people here. So that was another great advantage. But it also created a disadvantage because we had this influx of people and there wasn't room for everybody. So these little towns were just strained to the bone, trying to, get people to, they were putting up tents. They had all these, they were just trying to build things as quickly as they could to house everybody.
No, and how your country went from being not prepared for war to being prepared for war, and then at the end of the war producing way more than it possibly could ever use in terms of aircraft is constantly fascinating for us little Europeans who were struggling to do anything in 43, 44 onwards, because we just, we've got no steel left and no food left and what have you. And the lengths you went to mobilize the entire nation was extraordinary. So and you mentioned Enola Gay. So let's for the people watching this, explain that connection and how that ended up in Nebraska, or being made in Nebraska.
Yes. Well, the Glenn Martin bombing factory was at Fort Crook, which is in Omaha, Nebraska. And Colonel Paul Tibbets came, and that's where they were building the B-29s. And he selected the Enola Gay and the other one, I can't remember, Little Boy, or was that the name of the bomb? Yeah. And he personally selected that, the Enola Gay, off the line there. And that, of course, as we all know, is what dropped the bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki.
Yeah. Well, that's a big claim to fame, a controversial claim to fame, but a big claim to fame. And so, those little details are amazing. But I want to go on to the war dogs, because that was the bit I had no knowledge about. So explain what the war dog program was and how it ended up in Nebraska, and how you discovered that part of it, because that's the extraordinary story.
Yes, well, that is kind of when I worked at Fort Robinson, again, I had heard about this. And since it was a remount depot for horses, they were able to convert it to, training war dogs. And the war dog program kind of started off very slowly. Dogs have been used in warfare for a long time, but training them was something that the United States had never done before. So when they started these programs, they picked Fort Robinson because it was an ideal location. Again, a lot of space up there. There's also a lot of buttes in the landscape, so it was really great for training. And what always surprises me about this program is that people donated their dogs to the war effort. It wasn't like there was a bunch of breeders breeding a certain type of dog to be trained as a war dog. People were giving their pets and donating them to the Dogs for Defense program so they could go and, serve their country. And I think about that today, and, I have a dog, and I think, would I be willing to send my dog, to war, to be trained, to possibly be killed? Because many of them did die in service to their country. And I just am always constantly amazed at how people could do that.
So what was the role of war dogs? What were they anticipating these dogs doing? Because if they're getting a whole variety of pet dogs, all shapes and sizes, temperaments, what was the plan?
Well, they wanted to train them for certain different duties. One of them, like for the Coast Guard used them a lot as sentry dogs.
Yeah.
There were messenger dogs that they used, and they had to get them. I mean, messenger dogs, could go, behind enemy lines or wherever they needed to go, a lot easier than a man could without being discovered. And they tried to get them so that when they were on patrols, the dog could, sniff out the enemy and alert the point man, that hey, they're up ahead. They also did stuff with sniffing explosives and things like that. There's a great historian, her name's Hannah Palza, who works on this Dogs for Defense, the War Dogs program, and she would be great to talk to about this.
Yeah.
But it was just and not every dog was suitable. We didn't have little toy poodles or anything like that. It was, the German Shepherds and the Doberman Pinschers and, those types of breeds. But what they did is, they trained them to attack. So I have pictures in my book of the trainers. They had, these big padded uniforms on, and they would train the dog to attack. So these dogs were trained to be killers, some of them. So they each had it depended on the dog's temperament. It depended on how well the dog and the trainer got along. And they usually formed a very, very strong bond. But yeah, it was different dogs for different duties.
But it obviously didn't get to be used particularly much in the actual combat theaters because it was more of a beginning of a future use for animals as opposed to kind of refining it for World War II. I mean, sentry dogs, sure, but now we take dogs in service very for granted, and guide dogs for the blind and sniffer dogs. But back in World War II, there was a case in D-Day of a British parachute battalion having a dog with them, Glenn, who was killed. But they're not accounts of dogs in combat in Northwest Europe are not very plentiful. No. So clearly it was unlike the paratroops, like the 507th. That clearly was a brilliant thing that went on. The dog side of things didn't necessarily get to be completely successful. But when we're talking about success, we have to go to the point where we talk about one of my heroes for a long time, and that's Andrew Higgins. So for the benefit of people who have no idea who Andrew Higgins is, who is Andrew Higgins? I'll put an image up as well while we're talking.
Well, Andrew Higgins invented the Higgins boat, which is what General Eisenhower said won the war for them, because it enabled them to launch operations on beaches. And that is what made the Normandy invasions possible. And he was born in Columbus, Nebraska. And I can keep going if you'd like.
Yeah, no, please go on, because I'll ask a question, because I think he's an absolutely fascinating figure, and I'll put up an image of a landing craft as well.
He is. He, born in Nebraska, born in Columbus, Nebraska, and he was just quite the guy, just bullheaded and stubborn. When he was 12 years old, this is after his father had passed and his mom moved him and his siblings to Omaha. He built a boat in his mom's basement. And the boat was too large to get out. So what did he do? He called some friends over, and they took apart the foundation, got the boat out, and then rebuilt the foundation before his mom got back home.
Wow.
So that just gives you a bit of an insight into who Andrew Higgins was. He was very inventive. He craved knowledge, and he was fascinated by landing craft and boats and all of that sort of thing. And when he went down to New Orleans is when he began building his companies and the Higgins Industries, and it became huge.
Yeah, I mean, he went from employing about a dozen people to however many thousands it was by the end of the
Yes.
war, with those photos of the landing craft going down the main street there in New Orleans and off to every theater of the world, and very inventive, as you said, but also kind of a rule breaker as well, didn't he?
Oh,
He
yes.
was a trendsetter. I mean, I particularly, because we'll touch on Japanese Americans later on, I like the fact that Higgins had a very forward view of the fact that people who worked for him would get the same wage, be they white or black or male or female, and he was doing this in the deep South in New Orleans, which was perhaps at the time not known for its progressiveness.
Right.
And so not only did he invent and come up with his factory, come up with the design for the landing craft, he also kind of was pushing forward social change, which got him into trouble afterward, because he kind of, as I remember, he didn't really make much money during the war because all the government contracts, they kind of used everything, but the government said, well, we'll give you all the contracts after war when there's plenty of money and peace for patrol craft and landing craft, and he kind of gradually lost them for being kind of outspoken. Do you know anything about that particularly? Is that
It was, I didn't really delve into that too much, but it was some sort of labor issue that he had. And it really, fighting it in court really cost him a lot of money, and he about lost everything.
yeah,
But what was so amazing to me is that he's like, even when he's down, he's like, I'm not going to stay down. I'm going to get back up and I'm going to rebuild. And when the Korean War came along, then he got more government contracts from the military and started rebuilding things. And I also think you're right about how progressive he was. I mean, he even had his sister start a daycare for his employees' kids. I mean, that just was,
yeah, at
kind of
that
unusual.
time that was revolutionary, wasn't it? Yeah, that
Yes, yes.
I mean, is that a kind of Nebraska or that part of the USA? Is that a tendency to be a bit stubborn and creative? Is that something that you would identify with?
I mean, I do. I mean, I think both my parents are very stubborn. And I think we do have a tendency to be stubborn because it's hard to live on the plains. We
Mm,
have, blizzards and crop failures. And we have, I mean, a hailstorm can, just take out your crops in 2 hours. It's kind of that you got to be tough to survive. So it makes you stubborn, and it makes you, say, you know what, I'm down now, but I'm going to get back up and keep going.
yeah.
And I really think that's, the Nebraska spirit, the Midwest spirit here.
So, talking of the adversity of World War II, how was your average Nebraskan affected by the war in terms of rationing and this? That, was it particularly severe there? Or, I mean, obviously, there's a farming state, so there's probably not a shortage of food, but things like rubber and supplies for keeping machinery going. Was it an aspect that was particularly tough, that part of the country?
I don't think it was too tough. I mean, I do know that, the rubber shortage did affect people because we have some very remote towns and we have people that live remotely from schools. So some people with the gas rationing and the rubber rationing couldn't get their kids to school because it would take them so long to get there. And then sometimes they'd have to, you couldn't go back in, one day and do it. So it affected people there. And even though Nebraska is a very large beef state, we grow a lot of cattle here, or raise, not grow. Um, the black market even sprang up here because most of the beef was taken by the U.S. government for the troops. So you couldn't just, and I know this probably happened. I mean, we've raised cows, my family is fourth generation farmers, and you couldn't just, have your neighbor come and get the cow. That was illegal. You couldn't just sell it to the cow or sell the cow to the neighbor.
Mm,
So, yeah, we had some issues with the black market here, which is what's interesting is it mostly happened in eastern Nebraska, where we, it's not as heavily ranch centric as it is in central and west Nebraska. Nebraska is kind of an interesting state. It's most of the population is on the eastern side where the big cities, and they're not big cities. I mean, Lincoln is 260,000 people. And we don't even have 1 million people in Nebraska, I don't think, or maybe very close to it. But So we're sparsely populated, but we still had our issues during rationing.
Because as I read your book, and I mean, I'm from the east coast of England. I live in France now. I mean, I was reading about the scrap that was collected and the scrap paper and the USO dance halls and all that. I would imagine, being where you are in the USA, the war would seem pretty damn remote. I mean, if you were in London, the war is there, right there all the time, because there's trails of aircraft flying over, there's aircraft crashing. Everyone knows someone who's had an aircraft crash down, the Luftwaffe pilot. Everyone knows someone who's been bombed out. I mean, obviously, Nebraskans have got people in service. There would have been Americans over from 42 onwards and Kasserine Pass and Guadalcanal. But the rest of the war would have seemed really, really distant, wouldn't it? So trying to motivate people for something that isn't affecting you, it almost brings us back the early period of the war. The isolationist aspect is that to make the war relevant when your day-to-day life isn't really changing very much, you're not having to dump into air raid shelters. Where do you think they found the motivation to get people involved in a war effort?
I think a lot of that, like if we're going to talk about the scrap drive, which was, Henry Dorley of the Omaha World Herald, he started a competition, and each county had to gather, whoever got the most scrap of, per capita in a county would win. And it pit county against county in Nebraska, and people just really got into it. It was a big competition, and they were publishing daily news reports on it, and they had correspondents out making sure to get the right tally numbers for the day. And I think that was a great motivator for people. Another one was the North Platte Canteen. That was a stop. North Platte is basically in the middle of Nebraska, and that was a stop for troop trains coming and going to the war. And we had all of these, it was a canteen just for servicemen and women, and it was all volunteer based. The troops did not have to buy anything there. There was cakes and sandwiches and cookies and donuts, and they served them every single troop train that went through for 4 years. And the word spread. And I think, and there was people from all across Nebraska donating food and volunteering to work there. And I think that really just, that brought the war home, because they saw these men and women going off to war or coming back from war. And I think that made it, less remote for them to see the troops there.
Yeah, that makes sense. Seeing trains go past makes sense. So, yeah, completely makes sense. So I want to bring up you mentioned him earlier on, the other hero. I mean, there's lots of heroes in Nebraska, but the particular one you mentioned earlier on, because I particularly like talking on these shows about racial tension and prejudice and sexism and things like that. And, I had Linda Herview on a few weeks ago talking about the Black Americans on Omaha Beach, which was fascinating. But there's a particular hero from Nebraska in the 8th Air Force that I didn't know about, and I probably should have done until I read your book. And then I looked on the internet and realized there's quite a lot about it. It had just gone over my head. So tell me who we're talking about. I'll get a photo up.
Sure. His name is Ben Kuroki, and he was born in Nebraska to Japanese immigrant parents. So his parents were born in Japan and immigrated to Nebraska. First, they were in California, then they came to Nebraska, and they became farmers. And when World War II started, Ben and his brother were determined to go and fight, even though, they were Japanese. They were Americans. They were Americans, and they were proud of their country, and they wanted to fight for their country. And boy, oh boy, did they face a lot of prejudice, even just trying to get, into the military, because they just were not wanted. But what I love I kind of fell in love with Ben while I was researching his, and I would love to write a book. I would love to see a movie made of his life, because it's really amazing what he did. He was so tenacious and stubborn, very stubborn, very, very stubborn.
Bit of a theme, possibly. Yeah.
Yes. So when he eventually did get into the Army Air Corps, him and his brother were not treated well. They were called Jap. which actually was a very common term.
Yeah.
You know, it was a slur, but it was used in newspaper headlines and movies and everything. But it really bothered Ben when he heard this. And he really wanted to fight. He didn't want to be stuck in the typing pool or anything like that. So he eventually convinced somebody, hey, I want to be in a bombing crew. I want to go to England. I want to go to England. And he made it there, and they weren't going to let him on the plane. They weren't going to let him fight. You know, I think he was going to be in the typing pool again or something. He's like, no, that's not good enough. I want to show that I am loyal to this country, and I'm going to fight for what I believe in. And so during his off time, he started taking gunnery lessons and learning the guns and all that. And then when one of the, I can't remember for sure which plane crew it was, but one of them got injured and they asked him to fill in, and he did. He went on to serve the 25 missions, and nobody had a problem with him after that. You know, he had, you know, he'd been accepted. And then he decided, you know what, because his little brother had been kicked out of the Army Air Corps and he was just in the regular Army, and he's like, I'm going to fight 3 more missions just for my little brother. So he went on to fight 3 more missions, so he had a total of 28 missions.
Which for the 8th Air Force at that point the war was quite exceptional. I mean, some people going home after, well, some people didn't make it, of course, were killed, but you know, getting to double figures was quite an achievement. And with the 8th Air Force, I mean, you've got that with a crew like that, a person coming into a crew. If you'd got I guess once he got his chance, it was easy to prove himself. But getting the chance in the first place would have been the hurdle, isn't it? Because that group of 10 men in the B-17 or B-24 flying over Europe, every single person is essential, you know that. And then you're part of a bomb squadron and part of a bomb group, and every gun is important, every navigator is important, and one weak link could theoretically jeopardize the entire mission. So that spirit there of going, so what? I mean, there can't have been many Japanese Americans in Nebraska. Obviously, California had quite a few. He would have been a pretty from a minority of a very small minority in Nebraska.
Yes, very small minority. Yes.
So,
and what was, I mean, you know, when he came back from those missions, the U.S. Army seized on his, I mean, because Walter Cronkite was reporting on him, and he became national news. So the U.S. Army used that to their advantage, and they sent him around, you know, to talk about his exploits, and they also sent him to the internment camps, the Japanese internment camps. And because they wanted to drum up support for the 442nd, the all Japanese unit. And the younger generation of Japanese Americans were just enthralled with him. They wanted his autograph and things, but the older generation, they're like, what are you doing? They have taken away our civil rights, and you're out here trying to get us to join in the fight. So that was really bothering him. But what was so amazing about Ben is he's like, I still want to go fight the Japanese. So he pulled all these strings, got people to write letters, and he joined up again and served in the Pacific. And he was the only Japanese American to serve in a bomber group in the Pacific. And he went on and did he did 58 missions all total with Europe and the Pacific, which is just amazing to me.
It is. It's amazing for anybody, and it's amazing for someone who's dealing with all that baggage. And of course, my friend Stacey Hayashi, who you met the other week on the historian panel, she did her film about the 442nd. She knows all about that conflict of love for country combined with embarrassment of your country, combined with hatred of your country, because some of your relatives are being locked up while you're being sent over. It's a very complicated, nuanced thing. I took a family of Japanese Americans years ago, and they had relatives who were interned and relatives who'd served with great heroism in France. And they said, you know, we don't know how to define patriotism because it's all very muddled up with us. We love and hate our country at the same time, and we're still not really sure exactly how it all works out. It was a very interesting day I spent with these people, and that it's coming back to that tenacity, that spirit of the state. So, so what was your biggest were there any big revelations when you researched the book? Was it something you were really surprised about? Were there things you didn't uncover that you wish you had? I mean, no one's ever happy with a book. The minute they see it, they go, oh, I wish I'd done that now. But, what was the big thing that you wished that you were, with the revelation? What was the thing you were really pleased to get across in the book?
I think actually Ben's story was one that I was very, very pleased to tell. Because I had known about him, but I did not know how much he went through and how he basically, his experience in the war basically changed his life and put him on a path to fight racism and bigotry in the United States. He called it his 59th mission or 58th. Wow. Yeah. He's like, that's my favorite. Cause he's like, the biggest war I had to fight was the War Department, just the right to fight. And so he came back, and after he did some more speaking tours, he used the GI Bill and he went to the University of Nebraska, got a journalism degree, and bought a newspaper in York, Nebraska. He had the first Japanese American in Nebraska to own a newspaper. And he served the rest of his life as a journalist, eventually moving to California and living there. And he just inspired me so much. I would just love to see a movie made of his life because he's just kind of my hero for what he went through.
Well, you should get in touch with Stacey again because I'm sure she'd love to do another movie. It's the first one. I
should. That's a good idea.
Yeah, she'll at least point you in the right direction or get an idea together or something. And and I'm grateful to you for finding out about it because I just had never heard the story before. You can never know all the stories, of course, but I was grateful for that. So, but the other thing I want to bring on now, because not that we've dealt with the book, but what I find particularly fascinating about you is that you do your fiction, non-fiction, and fiction, and I find those worlds don't overlap very well. I'm not a big fan of historical fiction. I know that I do like the Killer Angels, the Michael Shara Gettysburg book. That is one of my favorites, but I've been sent others, and I'm not a convert yet. But how do you work? Is the writing process different? It must be. You must come at it from no.
Is that the same? It's like I have to use different sides of my brain or something. But what got me started in loving history was reading historical fiction.
Right.
That's what you said earlier. Yeah. So, I mean, I remember the moment I thought, you know what? I want to write a book. I want to write a story. I remember it was a British author, Rosalind Laker, and she wrote these wonderful stories set in 18th century France, and she did one on World War II, and it just brought the world alive to me, history alive. And so, I've been writing since, I was 12 years old, fiction. And then when I realized that, hey, what I do is I kind of combine the research that I do for my nonfiction, and then I get story ideas from that. And that's what's great is I'm always finding well, sometimes it's not great because there's all these stories I want to write and I don't have time. But just like Ben's story, I would love to write a screenplay for that. Or there was a group of women in Lincoln called the Lincolnettes, and they were the USO girls, and they had all these rules you had to follow. And then there's the war dogs. I mean, there's all these stories out there. And I think that's what, to me, history really is stories about people, not just events, but I mean, the people that make up those events. Yeah. So I get to explore those people and their stories when I write fiction. So that's what I really enjoy. I love to ask what if questions. What if, for example, my novel that Simon & Schuster UK will be publishing next year is about a German refugee from Nazi Germany, and he ends up in a small Nebraska town. Well, Nebraska, among other states in the United States, experienced a lot of anti-German sentiment against German immigrants during World War I. And I thought, what they did is, they, kind of took their culture underground, and they, didn't identify as being German anymore. So I thought, what if I took a guy who just escaped from Nazi Germany and put him in a town that really went through a hard time during World War I? What would happen? So I ask these kind of questions, and that is one of my big themes is looking at the xenophobia, how we look at the other, and that's, I can find that right here in my home state. There was a lot of Black troops that came to serve in some of the airfields and at the naval ammunition depot in Hastings, and there were some racial issues because Nebraska we don't have a very diverse population. I mean, especially back then. A lot of Hispanic people in Western Nebraska, but it's mostly, European immigrants, our descendants. I mean, my father, his grandpa was Italian, so we're, Italian, and my mother was Polish, her ancestors. So not a lot of Black people here. There's more some in Omaha and Lincoln, but the rest of it was just kind of a shock for these people to deal with this. They didn't quite know how to do it. So there's just that I like to delve into these stories and ask what if questions and get into these people's minds as much as I can, which is why I love to read, the diaries and memoirs of the time and try and understand that mindset, because I feel if I can somehow use my fiction to educate, that's also a good goal, and educate in an entertaining way, not a, bash you over the head type method.
That makes sense. I mean, I can see that you can do things with fictional characters that you can't do with real characters. You can have them, on journeys, quote unquote, that you can't. Right. You're stuck with the real history of real people and can't change it. So that I suppose works. I mean, but yeah. But you kind of glossed over. You just this big deal you've got. That's quite a big thing, isn't it? Simon & Schuster. They're kind of a big deal, aren't they? That's not some little tin pot, guy knocking out books instead in an underpass. That's big time. I mean, you must be really excited about that. Yeah.
I am so excited. I've wanted this since basically I was 12 years old. I've wanted a novel published. And so when it happened, I was just, wow, finally, I'm 45 years old, but hey, but I've had other success. I sometimes think that, the history stuff had to come first, and it better informed how I write my fiction. So I think it all happened the way it was supposed to happen. And I'm really, really pleased. And I hope I have lots of novels that I've written, and I have lots of stories, and hope to write more and publish more.
Well, that sounds good. I mean, I suppose the background as studying history gives you a discipline for keeping the fiction within the realms of what isn't possible. And conversely, there are other historians. I mean, Stephen Ambrose, none of us who are guiding or writing can do what we do without Stephen Ambrose having popularized history as he did back in the 70s, 90s. But sometimes when I'm reading some of his books, I kind of feel that Stephen Ambrose wishes he was Frederick Forsyth or Jack Higgins or something, because he kind of ups the ante on things to make it more dramatic. And I'm being very polite about Stephen Ambrose's writing. He's obviously no longer with us. And I think maybe that's the frustrated thriller writer coming up there, where he takes true events and basically pads them out with stuff from his own head. And that's not a good thing. And also, conversely, you have people who write historical fiction who it's all from their head and don't have the research behind it. In Brittany, we've got Sam Marlowe, of course, where that incredible book, the light that cannot. What's it called? The light that cannot. I've forgotten the name of the book now. The big one. Yeah. Anyway, they have a notice up in the tourist office saying you can't do the route from the book. People go there with a book and they try and walk through the harbour, and you can't do it. It goes, and you think when that was written, that book, they could have accessed Google Earth and Google Street View. They could have made the walk correct. But people go there to go, but if you turn left here, you end up in a car park. I'm supposed to be, and they're following the novel. Novel, you end up in some quaint church. And no, this is a car park. And they had to hand out saying the book is good, but it's not got a detailed model of Sam Marlowe. So I guess your historical perseverance to get things right will steer you correctly with and then you can do what you want with the characters, but you can't, you can't change the dates of the war to suit your narrative, for example.
No, can't put,
day a different day.
can't assassinate Hitler earlier or at all. But that is one thing I strive so hard to do, is get everything correct. I mean, I don't want to use outdated language. I don't want to change dates. I don't want to, I mean, there are some authors who do choose to do that because the story might call for it, but it really bothers me. I'm like, I've got to make sure. I mean, I go down to the bare bones. Like, I have a calendar and I look at the newspaper for that day. And I'm like, okay, what movie was playing? All right, I can use that movie.
Right, yeah.
I mean, that might be going a little too far, but I really like to get my details right. And because I know that people like me, that's how I learned a lot of my historical knowledge, was through these fiction books. So I want to pay it forward, so to speak, and, get others interested, because look at what it's done for me, that, reading those stories gave me 2 degrees, and I'll be working on a 3rd one, and led me to publish 2 books in nonfiction, led me to talk to you. And so I think the power of story is amazing.
That's true. You've maybe converted me, and I think there clearly are people who only read fiction who would never read what they would call a factual book. I don't want to read that. I like my novels. So I suppose you're always going to hit that different market, I guess. The other thing I think almost maybe the last thing is you've touched on Japanese-American relationships and the blacks and the isolationism and that kind of. How important do you think it is to be a little bit challenging about those kind of things? Because you could have written a book about your state that was just positive about dwelling on any of the negativity, and it would maybe be circulated a bit more. But it's important, isn't it, to get across the things that are a little bit, I make a bit uncomfortable reading.
Yes, I absolutely agree. I do not like. I mean, I in the United States, we've had a tendency in our history curriculum to gloss over things, to not delve too deeply into, why the Civil War happened. I mean, we still have people saying that the Civil War happened because of states' rights. No, it was because of slavery. And so when I wrote this book, I'm like, I have to tell the truth, even though the truth may hurt, even though the truth may be uncomfortable to sit with. But these things happened, and I'm not going to, I mean, I get kind of vocal on Twitter sometimes, but when you believe in something and you believe that these things need to, not be kept in the shadows, but we need to confront them. We need to deal with what we did in our past and how we treated African Americans and all of these different things. So yeah, I didn't shy away from those things, and I made a conscious effort not to.
Well, I noticed it because in Britain particularly, local history can be a little bit nice. It's a little bit kind of guys in tweed jackets with elbow patches writing about the church and the history of the church, and kind of glossing over murders and glossing over poverty and glossing over anything nasty happened. It's all very kind of Enid Blyton as opposed to and those books bore the pants off me. Right. And so I'm very interested in what we've almost got to the point where we've finished the studying of battles, and we know who was where at what day. What we haven't confronted is the why. We haven't confronted what turns people into Hitler Youth fanatics, where racial hatred comes from. With that, those are things we're still coming to grips with, and those types of things were particularly highlighted in World War II, and we need to go back and look at that and look at those tougher aspects of in Britain, for example, we had this idea that everything was rosy during the Blitz and you could leave your doors open. No, there was more crime during the Blitz than there had been before because people were going and nicking stuff, and admitting that we did that is part of the process of moving forward. This idea that, there were people who didn't want to get involved in the war. There were people who were racist. There are people who didn't want to help their neighbor because their neighbor was a different color to them. And those things, as you say, as uncomfortable as they are to understand, are essential for us to move forward and start learning more about ourselves through the eyes of those people in the past. So, it's I'll get off my soapbox now. I
absolutely agree with you.
So, have you actually started a new novel yet? Is there wet ink? Is it first draft? Do you have where?
Oh my goodness! I've written 6 novels, 6 or 7 novels, And the one that just will be published next year, I wrote maybe 6 years ago.
Okay.
And so I've written two since then. And the one I'm currently working on, I'm really excited about because I delve into the FBI and hunting down, because there was a big concern about sabotage and saboteurs here in America. And I, thought, well, let's delve into that and see how fun that could be. So researching has been great. I've been talking to a retired FBI agent who has a passion for World War II FBI stuff. So that's the fun part. The research is the really fun part. The hard part is putting it all together, making sure it sounds good, is historically accurate, but is also fun and entertaining to read. So that's what I'm working on now. And it's really exciting. And I can't wait to dive back into it. I just returned my edits to my editor for this upcoming novel that'll be published. So I decided to take a few days break, but now I'm ready to get back to it.
Well, that all sounds brilliant. So, and I like the idea you're going into something about the FBI and those kind of things, because going back to being a World War II historian panel of a few days ago, this idea, we didn't kind of touch on it, but the idea that women had in the past been writing about the war from a female point of view, is about romances and female spies and things, and only more recently have people, and rightly so, by the way, have they been transitioning into actually writing about battles and the more kind of macho side of it. And it's about bloody time, frankly, that no one should look at the name on a book and think, hang on, a girl's writing a book about submarines. I'm not going to read that, but there will be some of that, will there? There will be some,
Oh, yes.
And I guess you'll just confront that in your tenacious Nebraskan,
I will.
You're not going to change your name to Dave just to get a book at it. Yeah.
No, not at all.
No, absolutely, and rightly so. Well, it's been fascinating talking to you. I should point out, those watching, I can't answer your comments because my questions on my YouTube on my screen has stopped. I can't get, so I don't know what you've been asking, if at all anything, but I can't. It froze when the program froze 20 minutes ago. So whatever you was talking about, I don't know. But we will definitely bring Melissa back on when the book is ready to go. And I will, for those who want to know a bit more about home front and in the USA and what was going on in states like Nebraska, but also I guess the experience there would have been kind of not interchangeable as such, but that would have been typical of other states around their airfields and POW camps and war bonds. But I as I said at the top of the show, I like the fact you wrote about your own backyard. That's the way to do it. You should be proud of what your own state did. So that's fantastic. In terms of a bit of housekeeping for those watching, I've got a few new patrons who've signed up the last few days. So thank you to Paul Drinkwater, Robert Baker, Chris Woffenden, Paul Seaman, and Jeff Fuller for your contributions. Our next show, and hopefully there'll be no internet problems there, is on Friday with Damian Lewis, the author, about his book, SAS Band of Brothers. He was on a show a couple of weeks. He's going to be talking about his new book out, which is coming out this week as well. So it's 2 book launches this week, so that's always good to try and give people an opportunity to talk about their work. So that will be then, and I can't answer questions because I can't see them. So I'm assuming everything's okay. So thank you very much, Melissa. That was a fascinating chat, and we will have you on again. And apologies for the technical glitches in the middle, but we recovered in good. I'm glad it happened once because now I know what happens when it happens the next time. I'd had where the Zoom crashed before, but I'd never had complete internet failure before. So that,
goodness.
And it just went, there you go. So anyway, thank you very much for joining me. Get back to the word mines, as my friend Colin always says. Get back to the word mines and dig out a few more work further for your next book. And it's been a pleasure talking to you, Melissa. So this is Paul Woodard from World War II TV saying thank you very much for watching, and we'll see you all again. Thank you very much. Good evening.